At 12:42 p.m. on July 20th, 1944, a bomb exploded inside Adolf Hitler's conference room at the Wolf's Lair, his military headquarters in East Prussia. The blast was massive. It shredded a heavy oak table. It killed 4 men instantly. It blew out the windows. It collapsed part of the ceiling. When the smoke cleared, everyone assumed Hitler was dead. He'd been standing 6 feet from the bomb. 6 feet. No one could survive that. But when aides rushed into the wreckage, they found Hitler walking out, dazed, ears bleeding, trousers shredded, but alive. 6 feet from the bomb that should have killed him. And he survived. Again. It was the 42nd attempt on his life. 42. And like the 41 before it, this one failed too. This is the story of the men who tried to kill Adolf Hitler. Not Allied agents, not resistance fighters, but German generals. Officers who'd sworn oaths to him. Men who'd led his armies to victory, who'd conquered half of Europe in his name, and who, one by one, came to the conclusion that the only way to save Germany was to kill the man leading it. This is the story of 42 assassination attempts, the psychological journey from loyalty to murder, and the 6 feet that changed the course of history. To understand how German generals went from serving Hitler to trying to kill him, we need to go back to the beginning, to 1933, when Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. The German military, the Wehrmacht, the Reichswehr before it, had a complicated relationship with Hitler. Many officers were conservative nationalists who despised the Weimar Republic. They wanted Germany strong again. They wanted to reverse the Treaty of Versailles. They wanted military restoration. Hitler promised all of that. So in 1934, when Hitler demanded that all military officers swear a personal oath of loyalty to him, not to Germany, not to the Constitution, but to Adolf Hitler personally, most officers took that oath willingly. They thought Hitler was Germany's best hope for restoration, for revenge against the humiliation of World War I, for national greatness. The oath seemed like a small price to pay. But an oath is a powerful thing, especially to career military officers raised in the Prussian tradition of honor and duty. That oath would haunt many of them for the rest of their lives, because breaking an oath, even an oath to a monster, went against everything they'd been taught about honor and loyalty. Let me tell you about one of the first men to consider breaking that oath, General Ludwig Beck, Chief of the General Staff from 1935 to 1938. Beck was a traditional Prussian officer, brilliant strategist, deeply honorable, and by 1938, deeply troubled by Hitler's direction. Beck opposed Hitler's plan to invade Czechoslovakia, not on moral grounds primarily. Beck's opposition was practical. He believed Germany wasn't ready for war, that invading Czechoslovakia would trigger a broader European war that Germany would lose. He wrote memoranda to Hitler, gave warnings, argued for caution. Hitler ignored him. In August 1938, Beck resigned in protest, the first high-ranking general to break with Hitler. But resignation wasn't enough for Beck. Over the following years, he became convinced that Hitler had to be removed. Not just replaced politically, killed. Beck later became one of the central figures in the resistance, one of the main planners of assassination attempts. But in 1938, when he resigned, the idea of killing Hitler was unthinkable to most officers. The war hadn't started yet. Germany was winning diplomatic victories. Hitler seemed successful. Why would you kill a leader who's winning? That changed in 1939 when Hitler invaded Poland, and then changed more when he invaded France in 1940, and changed dramatically when he invaded the Soviet Union in 1941. Because each decision, each escalation, convinced more officers that Hitler was leading Germany to destruction. But by then, Germany was at war. And you don't assassinate your head of state during a war. That's treason. That's betrayal of the troops fighting. So officers who had doubts, who saw the strategic madness, stayed silent, followed orders, hoped someone else would act. The first serious assassination attempt came in November 1939. Georg Elser. Not a general, a carpenter, a communist sympathizer. He planted a bomb in a Munich beer hall where Hitler was scheduled to give a speech. Elser spent weeks hollowing out a pillar, installing a time bomb. The bomb was set to explode at 9:20 p.m., right in the middle of Hitler's speech. It was a good plan, carefully executed, should have worked. But Hitler left early. He was scheduled to speak until 10 p.m. But fog in Munich meant he couldn't fly back to Berlin. He had to take a train. So he cut his speech short, left the beer hall at 9:07, 13 minutes before the bomb exploded. The bomb killed 8 people and wounded over 60. But Hitler was already gone, missed by 13 minutes. Georg Elser was caught trying to cross into Switzerland. He was interrogated, tortured, eventually sent to a concentration camp where he was executed in April 1945, weeks before the war ended. Elser wasn't a general, but his attempt showed that killing Hitler was theoretically possible, that Hitler wasn't untouchable, and that close calls would haunt the resistance for years. 13 minutes. That's how close the war came to ending in November 1939. After Elser's attempt, security around Hitler tightened. He travelled less predictably, changed schedules at the last minute, avoided public appearances. This made assassination attempts exponentially harder. You couldn't just plant a bomb in a place Hitler was scheduled to be because he might change his schedule. You needed access. You needed someone close to him. You needed a general. By 1941, 1942, several officers were actively discussing assassination. Not openly. You couldn't trust anyone completely. The Gestapo was everywhere. Informants were everywhere. So conversations happened in whispers, in private, among men who trusted each other absolutely. And slowly, a conspiracy formed. A loose network of officers, politicians and civilians who all agreed on one thing. Hitler had to die. The central figure became Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, young for a senior officer, 36 years old in 1944, aristocratic family, brilliant staff officer, Catholic, and by 1943, convinced that assassinating Hitler was a moral necessity. Stauffenberg had been wounded in North Africa in April 1943, lost his left eye, lost his right hand, lost 2 fingers on his left hand, spent months recovering, and during that recovery, he made a decision. When he returned to duty, he would kill Hitler. But Stauffenberg wasn't the first officer to try. Between 1939 and July 1944, there were at least 15 documented attempts on Hitler's life by German military officers, or those connected to the military resistance. 15. Most never got close. Most were foiled by security, by bad luck, by Hitler's unpredictable schedule, by the sheer difficulty of getting near him with a weapon. Let me tell you about one attempt. March 1943. Henning von Treschow, a major general on the Eastern Front, and Fabian von Schlabrendorf, his aide. They placed a bomb disguised as a bottle of brandy on Hitler's plane. The bomb had a chemical time fuse. 30 minutes. Hitler's plane took off from Smolensk, heading to his headquarters in East Prussia. The bomb should have exploded mid-flight. The plane should have crashed. Hitler should have died. But the bomb didn't explode. The chemical fuse failed, probably because it was too cold at high altitude. The bomb was a dud. Hitler landed safely, never knowing he'd been flying with a bomb on board. Tresckow had to frantically retrieve the unexploded bomb before it was discovered. He called the headquarters and said he'd accidentally sent the wrong package. Could he exchange it? They agreed. Schlabrendorf flew to the headquarters, retrieved the bomb, replaced it with actual brandy, and avoided detection. But Hitler was alive. Another failure. Think about what that means psychologically. You've just risked everything, your life, your family's lives, your honor. You've planted a bomb on Hitler's plane, you've committed treason, you've broken your oath, and then the bomb doesn't work. Hitler survives, and you have to go on pretending you're loyal while knowing you tried to kill him. That's the psychological burden these officers carried. The knowledge that they'd tried and failed, and that failure meant they'd have to try again. By 1944, the situation was desperate. Germany was losing. The Eastern Front was collapsing. The Allies had invaded Italy. Everyone knew the Western invasion was coming soon. The war was lost. Every rational officer knew it. But Hitler wouldn't negotiate, wouldn't consider peace, wouldn't accept reality. He was going to fight until Germany was completely destroyed. The resistance conspirators believed that if Hitler died, a new government could negotiate peace with the Western Allies, could save Germany from total destruction, could prevent the Soviets from conquering all of Germany. That belief, whether realistic or not, motivated them. They weren't trying to kill Hitler out of personal animosity, though many hated him. They were trying to save Germany. That's how they justified breaking their oaths. That's how they overcame their honor-based reluctance to commit murder. Germany was more important than any individual, even more important than an oath, even more important than personal honor. Klaus von Stauffenberg was chosen to be the assassin because he had access. In June 1944, he was appointed Chief of Staff to General Friedrich Fromm, commander of the Reserve Army. That position gave Stauffenberg regular access to Hitler's briefings. He could attend meetings at Hitler's headquarters. He could get close. And despite his injuries, despite missing his right hand, he could still plant a bomb. The plan was complex. Stauffenberg would attend a military conference at the Wolf's Lair. He'd bring a briefcase containing 2 bombs, British-made bombs, captured and repurposed. Each bomb weighed about 2 pounds of plastic explosive. Together, in a confined space, they'd be devastating. Stauffenberg would activate the fuses, place the briefcase near Hitler, excuse himself, and leave. 10 minutes later, the bombs would explode. Hitler and everyone near him would die. Then Stauffenberg would fly back to Berlin. The Reserve Army would arrest Gestapo and SS leaders. A new government would be formed. Peace would be negotiated. That was the plan. Reasonable, achievable, except for one problem. Stauffenberg only managed to arm one of the 2 bombs, July 20th, 1944. Stauffenberg arrived at the Wolf's Lair around 10 a.m. He had the briefcase with 2 bombs, but he needed privacy to activate them. The bombs had chemical fuses. You crushed a glass vial. The acid would eat through a wire. 10 minutes later, the wire would break and trigger the detonator. But Stauffenberg only had one hand. Activating the fuses with one hand was difficult and slow. Stauffenberg asked to use an anteroom to freshen up before the meeting. He went in with his aide, Werner von Haften. They had maybe 3 minutes. Stauffenberg crushed the vial on one bomb, started working on the second, but someone knocked on the door. "Hurry up, the meeting is starting." Stauffenberg didn't have time to activate the second bomb. He closed the briefcase with only one armed bomb, half the planned explosive power. It might not be enough, but he was out of time. The meeting was in a conference room, concrete bunker originally, but it was summer. Hot, so the meeting had been moved to a wooden barracks above ground. Windows open for ventilation. Stauffenberg entered. About 24 officers around a large oak table. Hitler at one end, leaning over the table studying maps. Stauffenberg placed his briefcase under the table, as close to Hitler as possible. About 6 feet away, then he made an excuse. A phone call. I need to take a phone call. He left the room. Colonel Heinz Brandt, another officer, noticed the briefcase. It was in his way. He moved it, pushed it to the other side of the heavy oak table leg, farther from Hitler. That movement, that casual repositioning of an inconvenient briefcase, saved Hitler's life. Stauffenberg walked away from the conference building, heard the explosion behind him, saw smoke, debris, chaos. He assumed Hitler was dead. No one could survive that blast. He drove to the airfield, bluffed his way past guards, flew to Berlin, ready to activate the coup, ready to announce Hitler's death, ready to save Germany. But Hitler wasn't dead. The bomb had exploded. The blast was massive. But the wooden building, unlike a concrete bunker, didn't contain the explosion. The force went out through the open windows, and the heavy oak table leg, with the briefcase pushed behind it, shielded Hitler from the worst of the blast. He was thrown to the floor. His eardrums ruptured. His legs were burned. His trousers were shredded. But he was alive, conscious, walking within minutes. 4 men died in the explosion. Colonel Brandt, the man who'd moved the briefcase, was one of them. Ironic, he died from the bomb he'd inadvertently shielded Hitler from. But Hitler survived, and within an hour, he was on the radio, reassuring the German people, proving he was alive, calling it divine providence, saying that fate had preserved him to lead Germany to victory. The coup collapsed immediately. When the conspirators in Berlin heard Hitler on the radio, they knew it was over. Some, like General Beck, committed suicide immediately. Stauffenberg was arrested that night. He and several co-conspirators were shot in the courtyard of the War Ministry, shot by firing squad around midnight. Stauffenberg's last words, reportedly, were "Long live sacred Germany." He died believing he'd failed his country. But the reprisals didn't end with Stauffenberg. Hitler was furious, paranoid. He ordered a massive investigation. The Gestapo arrested thousands, anyone with even tangential connection to the conspiracy. Over 7,000 people were arrested. About 5,000 were executed. Some by hanging with piano wire, slow strangulation. Hitler watched films of the executions. The trials were show trials, public humiliations. Defendants weren't allowed lawyers, were shouted down by judges, convicted before proceedings even started. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the famous Desert Fox, was implicated. He probably knew about the conspiracy, but hadn't actively participated. Didn't matter. Hitler gave him a choice: public trial and execution, which would disgrace his family, or suicide, and his family would be protected, his reputation preserved. Rommel chose suicide. October 14th, 1944. Took cyanide, died in his car on a quiet road, given a state funeral, honoured as a hero. But everyone in the inner circle knew the truth. Hitler had killed Rommel. The July 20th plot was the closest anyone came to killing Hitler. 6 feet. That's how close the bomb was when it exploded. 6 feet. And Hitler survived because of 3 factors. The meeting location changed from a bunker to a wooden building. The briefcase was moved behind a table leg, and Stauffenberg only armed one of the 2 bombs. 3 factors, any one of them different, and Hitler dies. The war potentially ends differently, maybe earlier, maybe with millions of lives saved. But that's not what happened. Hitler survived, and his survival created a myth. Hitler started calling it a miracle, divine providence, destiny. He'd survived 42 assassination attempts, he claimed. Though that number was probably exaggerated, many alleged attempts were rumours or minor threats, but several, maybe a dozen, maybe 15, were genuine attempts by German officers, and Hitler survived them all. That created a psychological effect among German officers and soldiers. Hitler seemed invincible, protected by fate. How else could you explain surviving that many assassination attempts? How else could you explain walking away from a bomb blast that killed 4 men standing near him? It must be destiny. It must mean something. Maybe Hitler was right. Maybe Germany would still win. That's the perverse effect of failed assassinations. They don't weaken the target. They strengthen them. They create an aura of invincibility. They make the leader seem chosen, protected, destined. And that makes future attempts less likely because people start to believe that killing this person is impossible. After July 20th, no more serious attempts were made. Not because people stopped wanting Hitler dead, but because security was impenetrable. Because the reprisals were so brutal that no one dared try. Because Hitler rarely left his bunker. And because, frankly, the war was ending anyway. By late 1944, Germany was being invaded from both east and west. Hitler's death wouldn't change that. Wouldn't save Germany. It was too late. Hitler died on April 30th, 1945, in his bunker in Berlin as Soviet forces closed in, by suicide. He shot himself. So in the end, Hitler was killed by an assassination attempt, the 43rd, his own, the only one that succeeded. But let's talk about the men who tried and failed, because their story is more than just a list of attempts. It's a story about the psychology of resistance, about the journey from loyalty to rebellion, about the moral calculations required to go from a sworn soldier to assassin. These weren't all good men. Many had served Hitler loyally for years, had commanded units in invasions of Poland, France, the Soviet Union, had overseen occupations, had, in some cases, been complicit in war crimes. Their resistance wasn't purely moral, it was also practical. They saw that Hitler was destroying Germany, that the war was lost, that continued fighting meant total annihilation. So they acted partly from patriotism, partly from self-preservation, partly from belated moral awakening, but they acted, and that matters. They risked everything, their lives, their families, their honor, the oath they'd sworn. They broke every rule of military discipline and attempted murder, not for personal gain, but because they believed it was necessary. They were wrong about some things. The idea that killing Hitler would lead to a negotiated peace was probably naive. The Allies had demanded unconditional surrender. They weren't going to negotiate with a post-Hitler Germany. But the resistors believed it, and that belief motivated them to act when most others stayed silent. Let me tell you about the cost of resistance, not just for the conspirators themselves, but for their families. Nazi Germany practiced Sippenhaft, kin liability. If you committed treason, your entire family could be punished. Parents, siblings, children, wives. The families of July 20th conspirators were arrested. Many were sent to concentration camps. Children were taken away and given to Nazi families for adoption. The message was clear. Resist, and everyone you love suffers. That threat kept thousands of officers from acting. They might have been willing to die themselves, but were they willing to sacrifice their families? Were they willing to condemn their children to concentration camps? Most weren't. Most stayed silent, followed orders, hoped the war would end before complete destruction. The men who did act, knowing what it would cost their families, showed extraordinary courage, or extraordinary desperation, or both. After the war, the conspirators were honored in West Germany, streets named after them, memorials built. They became symbols of the good Germans who resisted. But during the war and in its immediate aftermath, they were considered traitors. Soviet propaganda called them fascists trying to save themselves. Some Western observers questioned their motives, wondered if they were resisting Hitler's methods or just his losing strategy. The truth is complex. The motives were mixed. Some were genuine moral resistors. Some were practical patriots trying to save Germany. Some were self-serving officers trying to escape blame. Probably most were a combination. Human motives usually are mixed. But whatever their reasons, they tried. They risked everything. And they failed. 6 feet. That's how close they came. If the briefcase had stayed where Stauffenberg placed it, if both bombs had been armed, if the meeting had been in the bunker instead of the wooden barracks. Hitler dies, the war changes, maybe ends sooner, maybe differently. We'll never know because of 6 feet. That's the haunting thing about this story. How close it came, how many attempts were made, how many chances there were. 42 assassination attempts if you believe Hitler's own count. At least a dozen serious attempts by military officers. Hundreds of conspirators over 6 years. Thousands of people who knew about the resistance and didn't inform on them. And yet Hitler survived them all until he killed himself on the last day. What does that tell us? That Hitler was protected by destiny. That's what he believed. That's what his propaganda claimed. But the real answer is simpler and more disturbing. Hitler survived because of luck. Random chance. Briefcases moved at the last second. Bombs that didn't detonate. Schedule changes. The little accidents of history that add up to massive consequences. And Hitler survived because killing a well-protected dictator is incredibly difficult. You need access, timing, luck, courage, and technical competence. The conspirators had courage, they usually had access. But timing, luck, and technical competence failed them repeatedly. Bombs didn't explode, schedules changed, security detected threats. The mundane barriers to assassination proved insurmountable. But here's what I want you to remember about this story. These men tried. German generals, raised in a tradition of absolute obedience, bound by personal oaths, committed to honor and duty, broke all of those codes because they believed Germany's survival required Hitler's death. They were right. Germany would have been better off if Hitler had died in 1939 or 1940 or 1943 or July 20th, 1944. Millions of lives would have been saved. The Holocaust might have been interrupted. The final desperate year of the war might have been avoided. But Hitler survived. And those who tried to kill him paid with their lives and their families' suffering. And history remembers them as the resistance, the conspirators, the men who tried, the men who came within 6 feet but failed. The men who proved that even in the heart of Nazi Germany, even among Hitler's own generals, there were people who recognized evil and tried to stop it. They failed, but they tried, and in a regime built on absolute obedience, trying to kill the dictator was itself an act of extraordinary courage, an act that most people in similar circumstances wouldn't have attempted. It's easy to judge them for not acting sooner, for serving Hitler before they opposed him, for waiting until Germany was losing to attempt assassination. But it's harder to acknowledge that they did more than most, that they risked everything when they could have stayed safe by staying silent. 42 attempts, closest missed by 6 feet, and Hitler survived to destroy Germany completely before killing himself in a bunker. That's the tragedy. Not just that the attempts failed, but that they failed by such narrow margins. That history turned on briefcases moved, on bombs that didn't detonate, on meetings relocated at the last minute, on 6 feet of distance between a bomb and its target. 6 feet. The distance between Hitler's death in July 1944 and his death in April 1945. 9 months. How many people died in those 9 months? How many could have been saved if 6 feet had been 6 inches? We'll never know. We can only know that the men who tried believed it was worth risking everything, and that they failed not for lack of courage, but because of cruel luck and narrow margins. Remember them, the generals who tried to kill Hitler, who broke their oaths, who committed treason, who risked their families, who died for trying. They're not simple heroes. Their motives were complex. Some of them had blood on their hands, but they tried to stop Hitler when most of the German military stayed loyal to the end, and they came within 6 feet of changing history. 42 attempts, 6 feet, and Hitler survived them all until he didn't, until he ended his own life rather than face capture. The 43rd attempt, the successful one, self-inflicted. That's the story. The generals who tried, the attempts that failed, and the 6 feet that separated one version of history from another.